There we go. Welcome everyone to the first Geography Matters for 2024. We are so delighted to bring this series to you once again, and I know the team have a fantastic lineup in store of fascinating and insightful discussions and presenters from across Australia and further afield as well. We kick off the year with a conversation tonight focused on fires. For those that have been watching the news, particularly in Victoria, a very timely subject and one that I think we can all do with knowing more about. So I'd like to start though by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we all meet today. For myself here in Brisbane as the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples, and we recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As I said, tonight we have a fascinating discussion lined up, and our presenter this evening is Professor David Bowman. Professor Bowman is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and Director of the Transdisciplinary Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania, where he holds a research chair in Pyrogeography and Fire Science, a fantastic title. He's recognised as a thought leader in wildfire science and management, publishing influential research in high-impact journals, providing policy advice to governments, and serving as an expert media commentator. Joining him tonight, we have Miss Kate Doyle. Kate studied geographical science at the University of Queensland with a focus on fire and emergency management. Upon completion of her degree, she was awarded the Royal Geographical Society of Queensland's Keith Smith Prize for 2017. Kate went on to work with the ABC, reporting on the weather and natural world. Highlights included swimming in an Australian-shaped swimming pool and regularly attending the AFAC and AMOS conferences. For those that haven't seen Kate's work, please do search it up. Her diagrams are a fantastic way to unpack some of Australia's wonderful weather. In the last year, she's made the move now to the Bureau of Meteorology, where she continues to talk all things weather. With that, I'll throw it to Professor Bowman to walk us through his work.
Okay, I will share my screen and hopefully everybody can see my screen. I hope I can see my
that's
screen.
Showing up now.
I might just get rid of this annoying sidebar if I can. I don't know whether I'm able to minimize it. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, and it's always difficult to know to whom I'm talking and how much you know and what experience you've had. Maybe you have had direct experience of fires. Maybe you're just becoming more aware or you're hyper aware of fires. But the challenge that I'm setting myself is trying to figure out practical and sustainable ways that we can adapt and coexist with wildfire. And this is a really nascent activity. Fire has been treated in a very strange way in academic disciplines. It's quite fragmented. It's often framed as a disaster, so there's an emergency framing rather than try to understand it holistically. Pyrogeography tries to think about fire holistically. So let's see if I get the next slide. Now I've got to work out how to advance the slide. So there really is a global wildfire crisis. What happened last year, 2013 in Canada, is just completely, literally off the charts. It's nuts. And then you had a very small fire in Maui, which just basically obliterated a small town, Lahaina. And these are very confronting, very visceral, very serious events that we're clearly going to have to mitigate. So the challenge is how you would adapt to these major events. So some of the work we've just recently submitted, we've looked at the motor satellite record. I wrote a paper published a paper with a group back in, I think, 2017, looking at very extreme fire events, more the geography of extreme fire events. We weren't able to discern a trend. And we've gone back to that record and we've looked at extreme events in terms of their energy. So the amount of energy being released, which is detected by the satellite, and we've taken the absolute extreme, the 99.99 percentile, and we've seen a tripling of these events. Very clear, particularly in the night record. We're seeing extreme fires occurring at night. And what's concerning and also fits with our previous work, we weren't able to discern a trend back in 2000. I mean, the record I think we were analysing was 2015. The last 7 years, we've seen 6 of the most extreme events. So with an amazing uptick, goes with lots of other things that are upticks. Obviously, we're concerned about sea ice, temperature, but this is very clear that we knew that the fire weather was getting worse, but this is clear evidence that the fires themselves are getting worse. So I want to sort of just dwell on the 2019-20 Black Summer fires that I sort of got incredibly involved in through writing a submission for the Royal Commission, giving evidence, and being a commentator during the fire crisis. It was really a terrible time. And I think that terrible time in some ways have been eclipsed by the pandemic, that we sort of like, it does seem like a long time ago, but actually it wasn't such a long time ago. And we've barely got onto the pathway of trying to mitigate and adapt to the threat of such fires. And we're seeing them, as I've just told you, more and more all around the world. So just to give you a flavour of how crazy that event was, some work I did with my partner, Faye Johnston, we looked at the economic health costs of the Black Summer fires, as they're called, almost a $2 billion health costs, again, just totally off the charts, calculated that around 429 people, statistical deaths. So absolutely clear impacts on the hospitals, but also in the background, people have been impacted. One of the other major features of those fires were massive carbon emissions, about 1.6 times the anthropogenic emissions for 2019. So just amazingly huge emissions. 2 studies, one that I led, but also a much better study that was by a Dutch group, showed this absolutely, stupendous emissions, absolutely nuts. And you can see in this bar chart the Australia's emissions of human sources, and then it's not quite, it's 1.6 times. It's not quite doubling, but it's an absolutely stupendous amount of carbon that was being emitted. And what really is horrifying, I suppose, is probably the correct word to say, is that last year I was invited to write a paper for the journal Science, and I sort of put together all of the impacts. So there were some major, obviously, biodiversity impacts, loss of life, but there were some very strange Earth system impacts of that fire event. The algal bloom in the Southern Ocean, ozone depletion. So a new form of ozone depletion was identified, and the stratosphere was polluted, and there was basically a smoke cloud circulating around the stratosphere. So very confronting that these fires are getting into the scale of volcanic eruptions in terms of having Earth system impacts. So that's sort of the bad news, that there's something very big going on globally. And what I'm interested in is, well, what can I do about it? So I have to change gear and think locally. And I'm going to tell you just one of the reasons Hobart is a sort of an urgent case study of bushfire adaptation. So, annoying thing. In 1967, Hobart was very nearly burnt to the ground. There was a fire in the northern suburbs, in the bushland in the northern suburbs. You can see these isochrons started, or what was identified, around noon. And by a bit before 3 o'clock, in 3 hours, it was burning down houses in the coastal suburb of Taroona. Made an amazing run. There were ember showers, ember storms, and it burnt a lot of houses. So that is the sort of benchmark until the 2009 fires, the 7th, which curiously was also on the 7th of February. The 7th of February, 1967 bushfire was sort of the gold standard of a terrible bushfire disaster for modern Australia. And we're seeing the imprint. If you know how to read country, you can see the imprint of that fire in the landscape around Hobart. So we're beginning to take a great interest in the 1967 fire. It's been spurred by the local insurer who's asking me, what do I know about it? I'm just going to, we've got onto an amazing data stream that's actually never been analysed, and that's the aerial photography campaign that was flown about 11 days after the fire disaster. So we've got an amazing record. And I'm just going to show you, this is South Hobart, and if you've ever been to Hobart, Cascade Brewery, I'm identifying. Now I'm going to zoom in. It's annoying me, this thing, but maybe I can do it that way. There's the brewery, and I want you to look at that. If you look very carefully, you can see houses that have been burnt down, but there are two features that just completely blew me away when I saw this. The first feature is how open it is. It's just amazingly open, and I'll show you, to prove that. And the second thing is that the canopies of the eucalypts in the eucalypt forests, say here in Knocklofty, are not incinerated, they're just scorched. So in terms of the fires we're seeing on the mainland, most recent fires, that's actually not a major severe fire, and it still was one hell of a disaster. Now I'm going to hopefully blow your minds by showing you now, kaboom. And if that doesn't frighten you, I don't know what will, because that, and we can toggle back, the forest is just engulfing South Hobart. And if that burns at a high severity, there will be no South Hobart. It'll be Lahaina. It'll just be an absolute nightmare. And that's why the insurance industry, who I'm increasingly working with, are saying in Hobart, they don't know how much longer they'll be able to offer bushfire insurance, but their window is closing. They're talking in 5 years. There may not be actually a financially viable bushfire option for a place like Hobart. And that's kind of intense because there's so many billions of dollars of infrastructure that's at risk from a major fire disaster. So I'm very interested in integrated fuel management, how you could make a place like Hobart safe. This little graphic that I put together, there's lots of things we can do. We could have cultural burning, maybe in the hinterland. We can have prescribed burning in the hinterland. We can have green fire breaks. We can have herbivores. We can have mechanical thinning. Obviously, we can have well-designed fireproof houses with appropriate defendable space. So that's sort of the vision thing. And that's where we're going to have to get a place like Hobart. It's going to have to require a major change. The hinterland and the bushland interface around Hobart is going to have to change radically. And if not only for Hobart to survive, but if the insurance industry is going to be able to continue offering home insurance for bushfires. So one of the amazing things with Lahaina is that this house was properly retrofitted and it survived the fire. I mean, it looks like it was Photoshopped, but it's not. It's actually possible to make houses and gardens really very fire safe. Let alone what you can do to the hinterland. So we're not talking, it's not a pipe dream, it is actually possible. But there's some really, really big challenges and sort of debating points that we've got to argue through. And you might want to discuss some of these. Who pays for bushfire management is actually not a settled issue. It's a very complicated issue at the moment. Here in Tasmania, the fire service funding model is broken and the government doesn't know what to do, but it's going to have to change, and it will require some sort of levies or taxes or something. We just don't know. I'm on a round table with the minister and they're just trying to figure out what the hell to do because it doesn't work. We've got to figure out a way of incentivizing adaptation. How do we reward good behaviour? There is talk, I was talking to the insurance industry today, that in Canada, what they're doing is they're giving people benefits on their insurance if they retrofit their houses and improve their garden design. We've got to strike a balance between firefighting and fuel management. It's very easy to get caught up in big machines. So firefighting, basically having a big air force, and forget about the need to manage fuel and manage bushland. We have to ask whether the current bushfire doctrine of self-organised mass relocations is possible, or even an appropriate response to catastrophic fire weather. So currently, under the modern bushfire doctrine and the Australian Fire Danger Rating, catastrophic fire weather, the official advice is for people to make decisions and leave, which I would describe as self-organised mass relocation. A place like Hobart, you'll have the world's biggest traffic jam. I don't even want to think what would happen if people realised that there was a serious fire just behind Mount Wellington. We've got to figure out how to involve Indigenous communities and people justly in fire management, because they do have a stake in this topic, and not just wanting to sort of recognise their knowledge or have some sort of tokenism. We've really got to figure out a way of paying people. And my recommendation is that there should be basically an unlimited number of jobs for Indigenous people in fire management. Saturate the market and get as many people as possible involved. We know that there are really good social and health benefits for Aboriginal people doing work on country. So it's something that we should really be incentivising, and you would get your money back just on improved health outcomes and closing the gap. Really fundamentally, we've got to think about how fuel management can be effective, economic, sustainable and biodiverse. These are really big issues, and that's basically the subject of my Laureate fellowship. But I also caution against magical thinking, that there's a lot of magical thinking out there that insurance is going to provide complete recovery. It's not, can't. The insurance industry is putting up a white flag. Governments can't pay for the necessary bushfire adaptation. It's going to have to be shared somehow or another. We've got to find a way where the community and government finds a pathway to bushfire adaptation. There's a bit of a meme out there that if you don't do anything to forests, they will ecologically self-organised and become bushfire proof, which is just nonsense. It's not real. It's dangerous. It's delusional. It's not going to happen. It's missing the point. We've got to really engage and help forests adapt and stop becoming significant carbon sources, I might add. So we've got a lot of work to do, and that's going to be, some of it's going to be quite confronting and requiring modification of vegetation structure, all sorts of interventions using native and non-native animals, maybe irrigating, using wastewater and so on. We've got to sort of recognise that total fire suppression of wildfires it's impractical. It's dangerous to think that we can have technologies to put them out. We can't. Likewise, we can't allow ourselves to believe that, you know, if we just go back to how Aborigines did it, the bushfire crisis would magically disappear. It won't. And most fundamentally, we've got to reject forcefully the idea that climate change is not the driver of the wildfire crisis. It is, and we have to deal with that. And that means that we're on a very steep, rapid, and urgent learning curve. So all of those issues are captured in my Laureate Fellowship that I'm using Hobart as a case study, but I'm working with the reinsurers, working with the Aboriginal community. I'm doing social science, thinking about community attitudes. I'm doing a lot of fundamental sort of biophysical work, and I'm also thinking about how landscapes have changed. So it's a really fun, exciting project, and I'm really privileged to be able to be taking it on. So I think I'll stop sharing now and say that's my piece.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. That was always great to hear you talk. You've got so many great things to say. I guess we talked about the Hobart fire risk there in particular. Bearing in mind this is the Queensland Geographical Society, traditionally we don't necessarily think of Brisbane or southeast Queensland as places that get a lot of fire. Do you have a take on how the bushfire risk around Queensland might be changing, and what we need to be thinking of perhaps in even places like Queensland that don't have a 67 fire to reference?
Yeah, that's right. So that's part of the problem. There have been some astonishingly intense fires in southern Queensland. We did a quick analysis actually of those fires back in spring, and one of the things we noticed, it was in the conversation, we noticed particularly the night hotspots were just extraordinarily historically anomalous. And that goes with fuel dryness, and fuel dryness goes with increased temperatures. So anywhere that's experiencing, you know, these hotter temperatures, which is everywhere, is going to be increasingly at risk. Just to underscore how crazy this is, and maybe how crazy my life is, I was giving evidence, I suppose, or advice to the researcher for the UK Parliament last night. And in Britain, they're sort of having briefings on many of the hazards which are coming their way, including wildfire. And you don't think of the British Isles as a place that should be preparing for extreme wildfires. And it has to, and they are. And they said to me, if you had one message for the parliamentarians, what would be the message? And I was saying, this is serious now. This is actually serious. This is equivalent to the destruction of the cryosphere. This is not a game anymore. This is diabolically serious. And what sort of is good for my sanity, I suppose, is that, putting aside all of the, ecological and biodiversity issues, when you work with the reinsurers and the insurance industry and they're saying this is serious, they figured that out themselves, then you really do know it's serious, because they're crunching the numbers and they're just going, wow. What they don't like, they're seeing with fire, is not fire as the new tsunami, what they don't like about fire is they're seeing a very rapid change in the behaviour of fire disasters. So that's happened particularly, and it fits with our work that we've just submitted. Around 2015, there's been a sort of a step change, and certainly it's an emerging pattern. We're doing a global analysis of fire disasters, and you can see why the insurance industry is not panicking, but they're just going, ooh, they're recalculating of how they're going to deal with this. So a place like Brisbane is absolutely a prime, it's a sitting duck for a major disaster. I don't know when, but I've been to Brisbane over the years, and there's, it's got all of the elements for a nasty fire. It's got lots of bush intermixed with houses. It's got undulating terrain. It's got, complicated wind fields, and it's got a community that's not really all that keyed into a fire disaster, and it's got a terribly complicated road network. So you've got the ingredients there to potentially kill a lot of people, because they won't be able, where would they go? And in that undulating terrain, it's very difficult to predict how a fire will behave. And one of the frightening things, and Lahina shows this, is that these fire disasters can escalate at speeds and ways that just overwhelm people's situational awareness. There are stories of tourists who were trying to check into a hotel whilst the other end of the town was burning down, because they were in a different mental space. They were on holidays. They weren't thinking about situational awareness. So we need to really not frighten people, but really start thinking in a place like particularly southern Queensland. We saw those fires, which were more in the interior, but there's absolutely every reason to think that there could be some extremely destructive fires in the forested belt. And that will be your sort of 1967 moment where something you just weren't expecting happens, and the trauma that goes with, the loss of life and people's livelihoods and homes and everything. It's not anything you want to wish upon a community. So we've really got to be not frightened, but we've got to be, it's not being alarmist to take this stuff seriously.
No, and you make an excellent point about people's awareness. I was reading the updates out of the ABC today, and there was an update about a family who was on holiday in the Grampians, and they couldn't find anywhere to put their, to camp for the night. And they just weren't even thinking about fire, even though, it was very clear it was going to be a big fire day today. And it's just hard when you're on holiday, or if you're not expecting something, to come up with a plan for something you're not expecting, which is why I guess this kind of research and the proactivity around it is so important coming up. I guess from a community level, what are the things that we can actually do? So what are the actual first steps from a community level if we're looking at the fact that this is a big problem, it is going to be affecting our local communities? What do you reckon are the first steps that we need to be taking?
No, that's actually like one of the biggest barriers to this. It's a sort of a chicken and egg problem. And that's why I've got excited here in Hobart about developing a demonstration site, because you can have all of the education in the world, but until a community can go somewhere, it doesn't necessarily have to be in their patch, where they can see a fire-safe house, they can see a fire-safe garden. I was talking to, I think it's called Resilient Building Australia. There was a community group that's got a really good app about how to, do a self-assessment on your house. So somebody who was affected by a bushfire, and they've become passionate about that. So there are these tools, but the problem is that then there's what's called the knowing doing gap, that you can educate people to be aware, but it's very difficult if the economy hasn't been built yet, where I would like to think there could be something like Jim's bushfires, where you could say, right, I'm aware that the climate's changing. I'm aware that my house is vulnerable. I would like somebody to come and do an assessment, or you can do a self-assessment.
Ooh, looks like we might have lost David there. John, have you got any luck picking him up, or is it just me that's lost David?
I think we've all lost David, but he looks to be back online now. We'll give him a
excellent.
sec to get his audio working.
We can stall dramatically for a second. I know he was juggling laptops earlier.
They've lost power, yeah.
All good?
Oh, you're back.
Hi, David.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that. It just suddenly vanished. And I was staring at a computer. That's one of the mysteries. So anyway, just going back to, Jim's bushfires, is that where I was up to?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we really need is not only to sort of educate people, but we also need to have demonstration sites. So you've got my mantra at the moment for adaptation of communities is that you need good research, which is really important. But research is necessary but not sufficient. You need to have good education, but that's necessary but not sufficient. The next two things that you need is demonstration of what you're talking about, so it's actually achievable and can be comprehended and experienced. So here in Hobart, for instance, we're talking about a demonstration house somewhere. You've been talking to botanical gardens, and they're saying, maybe in the botanical gardens we could have a demonstration site of what a fire-safe garden looks like. So and we're surveying plants. So what are the safe plants to have in your yard? What's the safe structure? But it's one thing to have a brochure. It's another thing to actually go and have a field day and do a visit. So I'm trying to build a demonstration site. And one of the things of the purpose of the demonstration site is demonstrating a demonstration site. So it's sort of, you need to be able to get councils and parks and wildlife and all of these other fire agencies, disaster agencies, to be helping communities do this work. Otherwise you get this impasse that the guy turns up, does a community briefing, tells them that people should be doing more preparing for the fire, which is fire risk is changing because of climate change. But there's no next step. There's no empowerment. It's just like, yikes, we've got a new problem, and I've got a long commute, and I've got, kids to educate, and I've got, all of these other things, and now I'm given homework. So we need that. But then the next bit we need, once we can build that hunger, is the incentivizing. And it can't just be punitive. It's got to be rewards. And that's why, working with the insurance industry, there's possibility councils that we could start figuring out ways. I even suggested today, maybe there should be a prize. You could have a community prize for the person who's got the best fire safe garden, or a community can win a prize for the best community prepared for fire. We're good at doing.
Forget tidiest town, most fire resistant town.
Yeah, that's right. And just trying to get people to see that it's actually tractable and not a horrible, crushing, and it's your problem, and we're just pushing this problem, a sense that the agencies or the bureaucracy just pushing the problem away. And I was really encouraged by the RACT insurance, where it's a community group insurance. They want to try to build resilience. They want to try to encourage and incentivize it. But these chicken and egg problems of, well, what would you advise people to do? So we've gone right back to basics. We've just written a review on defendable space. And believe it or not, in the academic literature, there's lots of brochures about defendable space, but there's no paper you can pick up and go, this is what defendable space is. This is the evidence for it. This is the underlying logic. These are the challenges of how to measure it or operationalize it. So we're really at a very, very, very entry-level stage in terms of wildfire adaptation at the community level. But but every little bit helps. And that's why I'm trying to get this demonstration site, because I know that if I could build one, it would just self-replicate so quickly because there's so much interest in it, because communities are busting to find a way to and these solutions we need for the wildland is not a bulldozed strip. It's got to be biodiverse. It's got to be really nice amenity values, so that suddenly there's all of these co-benefits. You're getting a community design, bushland reserves, maybe we'll do some irrigating, maybe we'll have some water troughs for the wildlife, which is going to be increasingly stressed because of climate change. So something I'm trying to get to happen around Hobart is I'd really like drinking troughs for the wallabies. I know it sounds madness, but I open my front door and I live in a suburban Hobart, and there's wallabies in my front yard because they're starving and thirsty.
They absolutely really decimated my tomatoes recently.
Yeah, well, exactly. They're desperate because it is actually very dry up in the bush. And so these are these things we can do to encourage biodiversity, amenity, get people a sense that we can actually have it all. The one difference between the ice sheet analogy and fire is, geoengineering ice sheets, that's tough. But geoengineering fire landscapes to make them fun, nice places, it's actually not that hard. And that then goes back to, the inspiration of Indigenous cultural burning, that, people have lived with flammable landscapes for tens of thousands of years. We're going to have to do something different to Aboriginal burning because of climate change, but we can be inspired and informed by it.
No, certainly. I mean, to use a Queensland analogy, wouldn't it be great if we could raise the houses before the flood rather than after they're flooded? And there's opportunities galore, just a matter of taking them, I guess. I guess the next question that I had leading from this conversation is, then are there already some good examples of communities that are doing this kind of work that we could look at as examples to go to? So even if we haven't quite got your amazing demonstration house built yet, are there communities that are doing a good job that we can look to for inspiration?
There's a fantastic ABC show called The People's Republic of Malakuta, and Malakuta is in Gippsland, and it got severely impacted. It was some of those arresting scenes of people on the beach and everything. The Navy coming and rescuing them, terrible. And there's this whole story of the post-fire, how the community was trying to organise what post-fire recovery would look like. And I haven't been there, but they hit on the idea of a green fire break was one of the things that they said, well, and there was some compromise, and it helps having Bruce Pascoe, the guy who wrote Dark Emu, is a member of the community down there. I have read about the Kangaroo Valley community in New South Wales that have done some really interesting work as a community group. I also have read about a community in the Blue Mountains, but honestly, it's still very sketchy. It hasn't been well reported, well researched. There's a great opportunity for somebody to really dig into this. So there's, lots of surveys of people's attitudes, lots of this, but a really coherent analysis of how a community takes itself from being in a bad place to a good place. That's just a wide open field as far as I know. But the People's Republic of Malakuta is a pretty good start of just the sheer complexity. That's particularly post-fire because a lot of people have been very traumatized. But certainly they had a lot of buy-in because they all had a very clear shared concern. So there's a really great opportunity for a community to do that, and I guess that's sort of what I'm trying to do here in Hobart. But it's complicated. But I'm very lucky. I've got fantastic connections with the local council. I know the mayor, and so there's lots of interest in this, but science is still missing. We're still at the sort of entry level part of it.
Yes. Now, I am not seeing questions come through the chat. Please do interfere, John, if you're seeing them come through. Likewise, if you do have questions to add, please do enter them in the chat. We'd love to hear you. Or if you're also having trouble getting to the chat, feel free to sing out and let yourself be heard. John, do you see anything coming up? If not, I always have more questions.
I don't see anything in the chat just yet. I think we got some fantastic questions. Keep rolling.
No worries. Well, I guess then leading on from that point, then, if you say research is in the early stages, where do you think we need to go? What are the research that you would love to see funded, that you'd love to see happening over the next few years that can really step us in the right direction?
Yeah, so I'm obviously very lucky having this Laureate fellowship, and means that I'm able to actually get started on my wish list. But what I say about that Laureate fellowship is it's like having a rocket, but you need rocket fuel, because the stuff you're doing has got to be sort of things I'm wanting to do. You need extra funding. And so we're putting in this grant for the demonstration site, because it's not building interpretive trails is not really science or research, but it's probably an incredibly important thing to be doing. One of the things area that I'm not funded to do and I'm excited about is economic, what are called choice experiments, where you can start. I reviewed a paper that was in Arizona, which used this approach. It's a form of sort of environmental economics. And what you do is you go to people with scenarios and you try to work out their appetite, how much they would be willing to be paid or willing to pay for changes in their environment. I think these questions, it's social questions of how people feeling about the changes that they're going to have to make to their lives and their gardens and the bushland that they love and so on. So there needs to be understanding of just how quickly you can take a community, and the problem in strong communities, tight communities, particularly communities that have got a great love of place, like Hobart, everybody's got an opinion about pretty well everything. You try to do anything and you're upsetting somebody, whether it's a cable car or moving the university or, whatever. So I'm just looking at this and saying, we've really got to manage these social sensitivities around landscape change carefully and respectfully, because if we don't, it's going to blow back on us. So that's an area of research I think is really important. Another area of research that I'm getting quite interested in is sort of more fire risk mapping, including the costings of different interventions and their likely benefit. So you can then go to the community and say, this is the amount of assets that we've got here, which is your suburb or your town. And these are massive assets. This is the sort of cost that we're going to have to make to protect these assets. So, when you put it like that, maybe people won't freak out when they're saying, well, we're actually going to be spending, because, I don't know what it is to cost to build a road, but, a metre of road, it costs, tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. We just think, well, roads are roads and you need roads. So what the hell, you're going to spend, $10 or $20 million on a road. Who cares? But doing that for fire management is still, the idea of major investment is still, we still haven't really made that case. And I think that's an area that is going to be really important, in addition to all of the other things that I'm doing in my Laureate. But they're the two or three things that I'm thinking about more at the moment. The other one that I'm particularly worked up about is the equivalent, the bushfire equivalent of a life raft, which is fire bunkers. Victoria is, well advanced in having fire bunkers as part of everyday life in bushland in Victoria. Here in Tasmania and all of the other states and territories, there's no coherent policy around fire bunkers. So we've got to work out why that is, and we've got to try to streamline that. That's something which is tragic, actually, to think that we're not something such a simple solution, of having a fire bunker if you can afford it, but they don't exist at the moment.
There has been a lot of, I guess the recommendations with evacuate, which has been the main push over the last few years, means that fire bunkers have been a bit controversial. Could you perhaps just explain that for anyone listening who might not be aware of why that's a sensitive topic? Or sensitive is probably not the right, controversial topic.
Yeah, that's right. So it actually originates back in the Victorian fires, the Black Saturday fires, I think they were called. I hate that like this, calling them these
2009,
black whatevers. Yeah.
Oh, we've lost him again. But the background there is there were some incidences with fire bunkers that didn't work out so well. But Dr. Bowman, or Professor Bowman, will be more across the details of that than perhaps I am. I guess while we're waiting to hope that he gets back, I guess I'll go through some of the things that I'm going to look up after we get off of this call. Looking up the Kangaroo Valley site, I wasn't aware of that one, so I'd be interested to see what the potential there is. And just for anyone else looking for more things to look up on fire and some potential reading on that. Oh, is he back?
Yep. Oh. Yeah, sorry, my internet was, for reasons that I can't explain, is obviously very unstable. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. You're rising like a phoenix back from the ashes, David. So can you talk to us about fire bunkers?
What I could do is turn the video off, and I'd probably be a lot more stable. So is that improve things?
You're sounding good to me.
Right, okay. So why fire bunkers are important is that back in 2009, with the Victorian fires, which killed 173 people, there was recognition that something went terribly wrong with at that point, the doctrine of to shelter in place. So people were sheltering in place, and intuitively, sort of if you're a human, they were thinking, well, I'll go to the bathroom because bathrooms are sort of cool and they're moist. But unfortunately, bathrooms don't have windows you can look out from. They're opaque. So a lot of people got trapped in houses, in bathrooms particularly, and died. And then there was another identified syndrome of death, which was people fleeing at the last minute and then getting a fire running over the road and killing them on the road, which is terrible. And then, so you had this, and then there were some people who did have fire bunkers, informal fire bunkers, and they died, which, like shipping containers and wine cellars and things. So what came out of that were two really clear recommendations, which were acted on by the Victorians. One was to reform the view of stay and defend, which has shifted to self-organised relocation, leave early, because it was under catastrophic fire weather, it's just too big a danger. What the Victorians also did was that they developed engineering guidelines, and they're not Australian standards, but they were Australian there's a difference between an Australian standard and AS. There was the one behind that they got engineers to sit down and go, right, what would you need for a fire shelter bunker to be safe? And I have read those recommendations, those guidelines, and they're very clear. and they're very sensible, and they've thought about everything. They've thought about the number of litres of air you need, and they've thought about entrapment risks, and they've thought about needing a periscope or a window, and they've thought about everything because they're very clever engineers. And what the Victorians did is they said, well, that's good. We can now find a administrative path to allow people to install these things, and we can find an administrative path to allow people to commercially manufacture these things. So Victoria is actually in a great situation that there's a pathway, there's these well-designed systems. There's at least 2 companies I know of. They look really good. They're very well thought. Unfortunately, the other states and territories did the first half of the recommendation from the Bernard Teague inquiry, which was to change, and this has become the official AFAC, which is the Australasian Fire Emergency, whatever. It's an annoying acronym because it doesn't scale to what it is. But the emergency service peak body, which is actually, by the way, not a government entity, it's a sort of a guild of emergency service people. They have agitated for this new Australian fire danger rating, which has got all sorts of complexities, which the Bureau of Meteorology has inherited. And one of those complexities is the call, which is a very, very consequential sort of part of the doctrine, is that under catastrophic fire weather, which is when it is judged that a fire will be so extreme in its behaviour, you simply should not be anywhere near that fire. So the recommendation is to leave early. Now, the problem with leaving early is what's early. What happens if a fire situation escalates faster than you realise? And where do you go? In a place like Hobart, there aren't really lots of options.
No, and that would have been an issue that we saw breaking out today as well. It's certainly something that there's plenty of upcoming debate for. Now, we've only got 5 minutes left, David, but we have had a couple of questions come in. So we might try and go through those quickly if you don't mind. Sorry to interrupt. So the first one is from David Kerr. We've got, do you think that the insurance industry can become the voice that the government, media and community will listen to with a view to taking action? Why might the industry be hesitant?
So it's very, very interesting. I was always maybe in awe or just not really knowing how to get a connection to the insurance industry. It just didn't seem to be something that a scientist would be able to find a connection with. And what's been really interesting and very gratifying is it's been a two-way thing that they've reached out to me, I've reached out to them, and I do know that they are extremely concerned about this. They are very real people, that they're thinking about risk in a monetised way. So they're thinking about it very in a very sort of pragmatic way, I suppose. And they are seeing climate change escalating. Now, I was driving along and I was listening to Radio National about somebody in the UN talking about the insurance crisis and climate change. And then they read out, some listeners' responses saying, oh, they're just price gouging. And of course they'd say that. And I go, oh no, that's just so annoying, because the listeners not understanding that the insurance industry really is very concerned about this. So they are, I think, as a fire scientist, you can be concerned about crying wolf, but when you have the relationship and the support and the crosstalk, the dialogue, it's fantastic that they certainly are providing a very different perspective, a very clear need to try to change something because of the risk. And yeah, it changes the debate from the government ought to do this, or don't do that, you're going to damage biodiversity. There's very sort of almost nebulous for everyday people, where it suddenly becomes everyday people can understand that, you're buying, that we were talking about it today, actually, looking at one suburb. You're buying a house and that house may be uninsurable in 5 years. So that sort of cuts through to
money.
banks,
Does certainly talk, doesn't it? If it's your house that's not getting insured, it's a real problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
so that's right.
Now we are coming up on time, but just briefly, we do have one last question about what do you think about the reliance on volunteer bushfire brigades? Any comment on if we need to start looking at alternative to the volunteer bushfire brigade situation, which we're heavily reliant on in Australia?
Yeah, that's right. So the bushfire volunteerism is a really interesting thing, the history of it, because it goes back to that idea of community self-organisation. That's becoming more and more blurred because you're not necessarily servicing your community anymore. You may be picked up if you're a volunteer in Tasmania or Victoria, and you could easily be asked to be deployed to Western Australia to help with a fire crisis. Now, that's like amazing and fantastic that you can do that, but it's not actually sustainable. And there is also increasing tensions amongst the professional firefighters. There's also more and more concerns about the hazards that go with this sort of work, particularly the smoke exposure and the level of training and now the new technologies which are becoming available. So the idea of relying on volunteerism for this escalating crisis, I think has got a use-by date, but then it comes back to who's going to pay for the alternative. So we've got to start thinking that through. And the point, if I can go back to the question of the insurance industry, they made a really important point to me today, and that is think about the cost of all of those houses on that side of the divide, and then think about the cost of the fire management. And then it starts changing the way you think about the fire problem, because you go, well, that suburb, there are, billions of dollars of assets, which of course the insurance industry is acutely aware of because they're being asked to insure it. So then you can start saying, well, economically, we've got this asset that's under threat. Why are we expecting a group of volunteers to give up their weekends to protect that? It doesn't make sense. So I would say that volunteerism, if it was me, I would be encouraging a different sort of volunteerism, which is community working groups, community phone trees, community sort of caring and trying to get, some fuel management and garden, green waste. Those sorts of things are probably going to be a lot more practical and more feed into a community, and then start professionalising the people who are going to have to go and do the hard work of controlling these crazy fires, and then you're less reluctant to go off interstate or overseas to do that work.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to see how it plays out over the years and decades to come. Now, that is bringing us up to time. So thank you so much, David. I'm not sure if you wanted to say a few words, John, but I've certainly loved hearing about it, and it's such an interesting space to be part of. So thank you for sharing all of that information with us.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry about my unstable internet, but I think we muddled our way through. So that's good.
No, thank you both, David and Kate. A fascinating session, and I'm sure I'll be having more discussions about fires very soon with people after tonight's topics. Thank you once again. As mentioned at the start of today's session, this has been recorded and we do hope to release it on YouTube very soon. Likewise, please do keep an eye on the RGSQ website and subscribe to our mailing list or join as a member to continue accessing these sessions and to find out about our next Geography in Conversation lecture and Geography Matters coming up in the next month. Until then, have a fantastic time, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you at another RGSQ event very soon.
Good on you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
And let's hope for the best in Victoria. Okay. All right. See you. All right. Bye.